wanted to talk about Memorial Day, and I wanted to talk about the origins of Memorial Day first, and then talk about some Black vets that I didn't necessarily remember learning about, but then again, I also, wasn't necessarily paying attention because my history teacher was low-key boring. So we'll see how this goes. And if you see me looking off to the side, it's just me looking at my notes because this is a lot of information to have in my head. And I'm pretty sure I was up until midnight doing this just because I kept finding new things I wanted to talk about and then had to shrink it down. So if we start with the origins of Memorial Day, right? Like one of the first documented instances of Memorial Day, this image is from the New York Times. And it was actually recently freed Black folks who were some of the first to recognize Union soldiers. So in Charleston, South Carolina, and South Carolina actually has a lot of really big moments in history, but in Charleston, South Carolina on May 1st in 1865, there were a bunch of Union soldiers who were held in a Confederate camp. And once the war was over and the Confederate side gave up, or supposedly they gave up, there was still a lot of Union soldiers who had either died due to exposure or died due to disease. And they were all just kind of lumped up in a big, like, unmarked grave. And so along with the Black Union soldiers that were actually allowed to even participate in the military, a procession of about 1,000 freed folks walked through. They went to the site, they dug up as many bodies as they could find, and then they gave them a proper burial. And that was known as the Martyrs of the Race cause. So that was kind of one of the first noted instances of Memorial Day. And then I think it was 1977 when it officially became a national holiday. But as usual, Black folks tend to do stuff and sometimes it gets lost in the sauce. But that's the kind of fun part of being a historical scavenger hunter, and I get to discover stuff like this. But first person we're going to talk about is this gentleman, James Armistead Lafayette. So I wanted to kind of focus on different war times. So this one is from the Revolutionary War. The curious thing about Homeboy is he was actually a spy. He was a double agent. So we all know when we think of spy, we think of like Benedict Arnold, and we all feel some kind of way about Benedict Arnold, right? Born in New Kent County, Virginia in 1748, which, I mean, I'm so used to thinking about the Civil War. So when I go back into the 1700s, like, it's amazing how many things happened during that time, during like the establishment of the country, but also like how many dope Black people were around. So essentially he asked for permission from the dude that owned him to go and participate in the war, because at that time, Washington was not allowing Black people to fight because, of course, the resounding thought at that time was that Black people didn't have the mental faculties to be able to even participate in, in military tactics, which is wild to me because you say that I don't have the intelligence for that, but I just built you a whole house with like a string and some mud. So whatever. Anyway, so he knew how to read and write, which was really important. Also, that could have had him, but his owner was down for it, and they needed somebody who knew the land. And so he went to the American side, and he told them like, "Yo, let me go to the French side and pretend to be a runaway slave," because at that time, the British were actually telling Black folks like, "Yo, if you leave your, the place that is holding you enslaved, you can come and fight for the British side, and then we will guarantee you freedom." So a lot of Black people actually started fighting off for the Brits because they were trying to gain their freedom by any means necessary. So Homeboy was like, "I'm gonna go tell them that I'm a runaway slave, and then I'll get you guys intel." So at that time, and like, I'm gonna try not to get so deep in the weeds, but essentially, if you're looking at military movements at that time, Yorktown was being controlled by Cornwallis, who was the good guy, and Armistead was chilling at the camp, minding his own business, and he comes across the piece of paper. And that piece of paper essentially was about military movements. So there were about 10,000 troops that were coming into Yorktown, and Armistead shares this with Lafayette. Lafayette was the dude who basically was his go-to person on the American side. And so he basically finds this little piece of paper from the British side that says like 10,000 troops are coming. He goes and he tells the dude that he needs to tell. And so the American side ends up being ready and prepared to like fight off the Brits. And after 3 weeks, Cornwallis actually surrendered, and 8,000 troops from the British side actually surrendered to the Americans, and that's how they captured Yorktown. So had it not been Armistead finding that little piece of paper, because at that time, the Brits didn't think that Black folks actually could understand what they were talking about, which again is like, it makes no damn sense. So they used to talk about military movements in front of him, and he would just pretend like he's sleeping or whatever. So he was able to move through conversations of these really high up generals when they were talking about like where they were going to attack next and how many troops and stuff they were going to have. Now, the kind of shitty part was there was a law in like 1783 that basically said that if you had fought for the American side and you were an enslaved person, that you would be guaranteed your freedom, right? So they kind of did Mr. Armistead a little dirty because they told him that he actually didn't fight, and because he was a spy, he wasn't technically a soldier, so he wasn't actually granted his freedom. But because of what he did and how he assisted the American side, the dude Lafayette essentially wrote a letter petitioning for James's freedom, and they said that we wouldn't have gotten as far in the war as we had it not been from the intel that this gentleman provided. And so as a result, in 1787, he was granted his freedom. And then to show appreciation, he added Lafayette to his last name to honor the man who spoke up for him. So, you know, shout out to James. I feel like I would like to be a spy, but also I ask too many questions and I would get caught immediately. So I'm gonna leave the spying to my mom, low key. Okay, this is my favorite human besides Beyonce and my mom. I like to say that Robert Smalls is my historical Beyonce. I love this man. I try to learn as much as I possibly can about him. I fangirl over him. Every time I've gone to DC to the African American Smithsonian Museum, I make sure I pass by Robert Smalls' section. Also, Robert Smalls was mad short. He was 5'5", but he was everything. So I'm gonna just keep it at his naval career because we don't have enough time for me to go deep into Robert Smalls and his awesomeness. So essentially, Robert Smalls was born in South Carolina in Charleston. Again, Charleston is everywhere in the Civil War. And he came up with a plan to escape. So he knew that because of the life of enslavement, at any given time, his wife or his kids could be sold, and he might not ever be able to find them. And he was like, I can't function like this. So he hatches this plan. He hatches a plan to steal the boat that he works on. So all throughout his working life, up until this escape, Robert Smalls had worked on the piers. He was really good with boats, but again, because of racism, he was never actually afforded the title of pilot, which is the dude that drives the boat. They always just called him a wheelman, right? So he was really, really good at what he did. So May 13th, 1862, and if you're thinking timeline-wise, right, we're 2 years into the Civil War. So May 13th, 1862, he puts his plan into action. They were traveling with a small child, and I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, they gave the kid the equivalent of NyQuil to make sure that the baby didn't make any noise, because it's the middle of the night, and this is one of the most daring escapes I think that's been documented. So along with some of his homies, he tells his homie you're going to be down at that port, and Charleston, the port that they're at is actually a few miles away from Fort Sumter, which were the first shots of the Civil War actually, that's where everything popped off. So he had his homie down the ways a little bit. He navigates the boat out of the dock. Mind you, the captain is sleeping on land, so at any given time, homeboy could have woken up and be like, bro, where's my ship, right? And so he gets on the planter. His wife and his kids are down below the ship. He goes to the first port. He picks up his homies that were going to do this thing with him because they needed to keep the boat running. He had watched the captain. He knew how the captain moved. He knew what the checkpoint signals were, and he just chugged along these checkpoints. And they went through 4 checkpoints, and right before they reached Union waters, he took down the Confederate flag and he put up a white flag, and he was like, I bring you a gift. So they grabbed the boat, and the boat, of course, had ammunition and guns, but one of the most important things the boat had was a code book that tells the Union soldiers how to decipher what the Confederates were trying to do. Not only that, they actually got Smalls. So Smalls understood the river. He knew the inlets. He knew the ports. He knew how everything worked because, again, nobody expected him to be paying attention. So after he makes his grade, one of the captains immediately asks him about, kind of what's going on over there. And he goes, hey, just letting you know, the Stono Inlet, they're actually not even covering that. So he goes, bet. He sends out a couple ships. They capture the Stono Inlet, which ends up becoming a really important base later in the future. And then that same general basically wrote a letter saying like, yo, we wouldn't have gotten the information that we needed to be as successful as it was if it wasn't for Robert Smalls. And so they sent him to DC to go talk to Lincoln, to tell Lincoln like, yo, you got to let Black people fight. Like, look at the example of what we could have, because everybody understood that the enslaved folks knew the territory. They knew how to navigate the land in a way that the white folks didn't. So you need to understand like the military advantages that we would have if you would allow Black people to fight. So the secretary was like, all right, bro, like you can go ahead. So then Smalls comes back and he's like, cool, I'm gonna enlist. But the general at the time who he was under was like, nah, we actually need you to drive the boat because you know these waters better than anybody else. So Smalls, he's a little upset, but he's all right, bro, whatever. So for the next 2 years, he actually participated in at least naval battles that he's mostly successful in. But the one that like really makes him the OG, you know, he's back on the planter somehow, and the captain of that ship basically is about to give up to the Confederates because they're taking on heavy fire and the Confederates are getting closer. So the captain is like, dude, we should just surrender, like whatever. And the crew is mostly Black. So Smalls is like, bro, like you're gonna be okay. You being a white captain, like they're not gonna treat you any kind of way. But us being formerly enslaved and like runaways, like they're gonna be really horrible to us. The captain panics and he runs down below. He's like, this y'all business. So Smalls gets onto the wheel and he navigates the boat away from Confederate fire. Of course, DC hears about it, and Smalls is one of the first Black people to be promoted to captain of a ship in the U.S. Navy. Now, real quick, timeline-wise, right? So Civil War ends in 1865. 13th Amendment is passed in 1865, which abolishes enslavement. 14th Amendment is passed in 1868, which grants citizenship to Black people. 1870, the 15th Amendment is passed, which allows Black men to vote. Smalls then runs for office, and by 1874, he's the first Black representative of the he's the first Black House of Representatives person from South Carolina. Here's my absolute favorite part about Smalls. So the people who used to own Smalls were going into debt. Smalls had become a shrewd businessman, and also he was just well-liked no matter whether he was in the North or in the South. Smalls then goes back to the people who used to own him, and he buys the land and the house of the people who used to own him. And because they're so poor now, he tells them, you can stay as long as you work for room and board. So you're talking in a matter of about 10 years, he goes from being owned by these people to them owing him and needing a place to live and to work from him. And to this day, the house is still in the Smalls family. Like, I mean, historical Beyonce. Like, seriously, this guy is like the best ever. And there was a joke that was going around in the House of Representatives that they were talking about Smalls, and they were saying like he's a step below Jesus because he was just like that liked. And he ended up passing, I think, in like 1914. So you got to see, like, he was able to see so the country change so much, and he also was like part of that. So anytime I can talk about Robert Smalls, like I'm here for it. Damn, I really just want to go back to DC, like to stare at his statue. But anyway, that's just me. And then the last thing I kind of want to touch on is the Buffalo Soldiers. So the gentleman that you see on the screen, his name is Mark Matthews, and he was actually the oldest Buffalo Soldier living. He passed in 2005 at the age of 111. Homie was born in 1894. He was recruited in Lexington, Kentucky, at a racetrack that he worked. He did have to forge his papers because he was only 15 at the time, and at that time in the military, you needed to be a minimum age of 17. But he ended up working for the 10th Cavalry Regiment, and he survived battles in the South Pacific, and then he came back and he worked as a bugler, and then he retired in 1948, 1950, around there. And if I remember correctly, the military was desegregated around 1950. So there's kind of conflicting records on whether he retired before or after the military was desegregated. But he did receive a lot of medals of honor. I think Harry Truman is the one who desegregated the military. But the emblem that you see next to him is from the 92nd Infantry Division, which fought in World War II. and they fought in Italy. So they definitely had a part in D-Day. But of course, again, a lot of people in the military didn't really think that Black folks were capable of a lot, which is just BS. But on July 30th, 1944, the 92nd Infantry Division actually was one of the first divisions to actually see battle in Italy. And it didn't go very well for them, because also a lot of times they put Black people in positions where they're taken out. They're usually the ones who are sent to open fire first, so that the white folks can then come up behind them and not necessarily be in danger. But the origin of the name Buffalo Soldiers, actually the term Buffalo Soldiers has been around since the 1800s, since the 1860s, but it has been adopted by different Black regiments over time. So in 1866, 6 all-Black cavalry and infantry regiments were created by Congress with the passing of the Army Organization Act. And their task essentially was to control Native Americans, which is bullshit because they're on their land, so I'm not really sure how we're supposed to be controlling them in the first place. But anyway, their main tasks were to, control Native Americans on the plains, or to capture cattle rustlers, basically to like keep the railroad crews and stuff safe. There's, again, conflicting documents that talk about the origin of the Buffalo Soldiers, but essentially they were given that nickname by the Native Americans that they were in contact with. One theory says that because of the hair of the Black men, they said that it looked like the hair that is around the neck of a buffalo. But the prevailing facts that I've found is that because of the fierceness of the way that they fought, they said that they fought with the strength of a buffalo. And so that nickname kind of just stuck, and it was passed on along. So there were Civil War, Black armies in the Civil War that also shared the name Buffalo Soldiers all the way up and through now. Also, there's a famous Bob Marley song called Buffalo Soldier. It's a term that is very strong to anybody who's in the Black military. And then I think basically what I wanted to do with this was Memorial Day is more, everyone on this call obviously knows that Memorial Day is more than just like a holiday for you to barbecue, even though it's great to like spend time with your family and all that. But we all have people who have been either touched by the military, in like direct ways or indirect ways. For example, our intern Betty, her dad served in the Navy. So it's like, there are a lot of stories that we could learn if people were able to give Black vets the respect that they deserve. And even back then in history, like Black vets were always looked at in ways that were unfair to the abilities that they actually could have. And so I just wanted to highlight a few Black folks who had done really amazing things. Surviving until you're 111. And the crazy part is, he didn't have any health issues. Besides losing his eyesight to glaucoma and to cataracts, he didn't have high blood pressure. He didn't have a heart disease. He didn't have diabetes. He walked without a cane all the way through his death. And the reason that Mr. Matthews passed was that he ended up catching pneumonia. And like, if you catch pneumonia even at our age, like that's bad. But you catch pneumonia at 111, like that might be the thing to take you out. But he doesn't get as much credit as he deserves for the work that he put in. At one point, he was also put in charge of looking after the house of President Roosevelt and making sure his house was safe while President Roosevelt was out and about being presidential. But yeah, I think these Fridays and are just going to be an opportunity for us to kind of learn something new. And then, if you guys have questions, if you guys want to talk about it, I'm always down. This is what I do for work and also for fun. So it's never a hardship for me to find a reason to talk about history. And if anybody wants to know more about Robert Smalls, I will happily and gladly gush about Mr. Smalls at any given day. But yeah, that's pretty much all I had. I was trying to keep this at like 15 minutes, and I'm actually really surprised that I did, but thanks, man.
Are you going to do questions?
Sure, if people have questions. I was just planning on watching Beyonce after this to calm down, so.
Hey, AJ, if you're planning on doing a sort of follow-up to this topic, thinking about the anecdote you told about Robert Smalls being able to buy the property of his former owners from them, I'd be curious, just because I feel like so much of like modern problems with poverty and things like that have been due to policies that prevented Black people from accumulating wealth.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like I'd be curious to know more about how Robert Smalls accumulated enough wealth to like buy that property, whether that was via his military service, and then like tangentially, um, I'd be interested to learn more about like the GI Bill after World War II and how that, a lot of the ways in which people were supposed to build wealth thanks to their military service were often kept from Black people who served in the military all throughout the history of the military. So yeah,
Yeah.
Robert Smalls just kind of sparked some thoughts about that. I'd be curious to hear more from you.
Yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, I know. I mean, obviously, we know the GI Bill had mad racist practices, so that kind of like just low key explains a lot. But Robert Smalls was a really good businessman, and because he had achieved the rank of captain, he afforded X amount of money. A lot of Black soldiers not get. And I will say this: Robert Smalls was charismatic. Like he was, according to the books that I've been reading, he was considered very good looking. He was born to a Native mother and to an African father. There are rumors that his father may have been one of the people who was on the boat that was one of the last ships that was smuggling Black people from Africa. But again, sometimes, especially with records that have to do with Black folks, it can be really difficult to substantiate some of those claims. But he was very well liked. I mean, I can hardly find, even like white folks in the South begrudgingly talk about his daring escape with respect. So I think that probably was the thing that really helped Robert Smalls get to where he got to. He was extremely charismatic. Lincoln liked him. The Secretary of War at the time was cool with him. The Secretary of the Navy really appreciated the intel that Robert Smalls gave. And so because of the money he was able to get, he also was a really good businessman and he was really fair. So the businesses that he was able to invest in also did really well because people wanted to be attached to Robert Smalls. And so he was able to gain capital. And I mean, the house was massive. If you watch the documentary Reconstruction with Henry Louis Gates on PBS, they do a section on Robert Smalls, and they actually talk to Robert Smalls' great-grandson, who is still kind of taking care of the estate to this day. But yeah, I think Smalls just happened to be luckier in that regard. That wasn't the case for many people. And the Freedmen's Bureau was created around, I want to say officially 1863, but really started to take off in 1865. And the Freedmen's Bureau was supposed to essentially figure out what to do with all the African Americans who had been freed, and also the 40 acres and a mule, which technically started with a bunch of pastors, but that terminology, that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to divide the land up in the South and give it to Black people. So you're talking about roughly 800,000 acres that needed to be divided up. So there were times where Black people did own a lot of land. I remember reading about a woman, and they do, again, records with Black folks. I remember reading about a woman who owned 90 acres of land, and her husband owned a blacksmith business, and she tilled the land, and she was able to sell the crops on the land, and she actually did really well. And that was during the time of Reconstruction. But then 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes becomes president, the Southern Compromise, and all hell breaks loose. So I think Smalls just happens to be a really good example of what Black people could achieve were the barriers removed, because for whatever reason, he just didn't have the same barriers. But as far as the GI Bill, everything, I mean, if you're looking at the GI Bill plus white flight, redlining, and all of that, no matter if, Black folks were even given the ability to purchase houses and to purchase land, if the white people in the area leave, then the property value goes down and then you're stuck regardless. So it's an interesting, I mean, I'm totally, all I need is a topic and I will happily go and look into it. But yeah, I think Smalls is just a really curious case. And also like his looks, I think played a part in it, right? Like he wasn't too dark skinned, so he wasn't too intimidating. Also, like he wasn't this massive dude of like really tall stature. He was short, 5'5" about. So then you don't come off as like the intimidating like Black man. And I think that really, he used that to his advantage. Whether he was doing it consciously or not, I'm not sure. But I mean, he was able to see a lot happen, because if you passed in 1914 and you were born during the days of enslavement, Robert Smalls was born around 1839, 1840. He was able to be part of a lot of change. But also on the flip side, if you're thinking like education, Robert Smalls actually was illiterate, and he learned how to read after he left the military. So, you know, I think through his own kind of just wherewithal and gumption, he decided that he was going to do more. But because of his legend, for lack of a better word, he was afforded the ability to do more with very little backlash. But excellent question. Yeah, totally down to look into that.
And do you know how long did he serve in the House of Representatives? Like, was his political career cut short after the end of Reconstruction, and once Jim Crow really started taking hold? Like, what happened to him, you know, between then and when he died in 1914?
Again, Smalls was lucky because he just basically turned into a full-time businessman. But yeah, he was elected in 1874, and he was done by like 1878. So it wasn't actually very long. The first Black man to be elected into the Senate was a man named Hiram Revels in 1870 to 71, and all he was doing was just like finishing a term that somebody else had vacated. But no, Smalls overwhelmingly won. Because people are like, hell yeah, we want him to represent us. And also by then he was absolutely literate. But yeah, his was cut quite short. If you think about it, like once Rutherford B. Hayes and the Southern Compromise was made, and like the military then left the South, the Black people were kind of just shit out of luck. And again, Smalls was really lucky because he got respect, one for his daring escape in the South, and also in the North for all the work that he did. But he kind of just, you know, he was voted out. I don't think for him it was like scare tactics. It was more like people just didn't want to vote for him because they were scared of what the white people would do to them. So then he never got reelected. And by then, I think during Reconstruction, there was from the local to the state to the federal level, about 2,000 Black men served in the period of Reconstruction. Now that's like 1870-ish to like 1877, because prior to 1870, Black men couldn't even vote anyway. So once the 15th Amendment was passed in 1870, then you saw this like tremendous boost. And also the percentage-wise, 80% of Black men who were eligible to vote did vote, right? And so the numbers, I mean, that is insane. So of course, it's going to represent the community that they're in. So there was all these Black men, I mean, sheriffs and registrars and, you know, polling people. I mean, anything and everything a Black man could do, they did. But again, I think Smalls is probably the exception to the rule just because of the way people perceived him. I wish he wasn't the exception to the rule, but it's hard pressed to find a story like that. I mean, even Hiram Revels, he was born free, and although he was very well respected, people would tell him if he went to the South, like they would try and enslave him, right? Like the Fugitive Slave Act was still in the back of people's minds. And so he was a little discerning about where he went and how he kind of moved through the world, but Smalls didn't have to. And I think that speaks to a lot of why he was able to accomplish what he was able to accomplish, and accomplish it so brashly. Like he wasn't necessarily a chill dude. Like he let people know who he was when he walked in. So for you to have that kind of just the balls to do that in the 1800s, like you had to be able to stand on your legend. So again, Smalls is more of like, he's like a unicorn when you think about it. A very small and stout, but unicorn nonetheless.
I wanted to, before we wrap up, I wanted to share with you guys the event that we're doing with the Westerlies, and our host is actually here with us, Willem. But we'll be having an online concert tonight, 5 o'clock, and it's part of our Fight From Home initiative. So we'll be having some opportunities for you guys to send out text messages, getting people to register to vote. I'm gonna drop the link in the chat. The website that I added, it has links to the different artists that will be performing, so you can check them out. They're really good. I'm super excited about Sam Pinderhughes specifically because he was, he is a part of Common's band, and they put out an album together, and it's one of my favorites. So check it out. Hope to see you at 5. Willem, if you have anything to add to that, you can go for it.
Yeah, thanks, Wally. It's 5:30.
5:30. Not bad.
That's the only thing I would add. But yeah, it's gonna be a lot of fun. Short sets from each of those artists on the website, and maybe some prizes for whoever makes the most phone calls. But we're just going to be calling and tweeting and emailing and being serenaded by some great musicians while we do it. So hope you guys will join us.
Yeah, come through. That's all I wanted to share. AJ, anything?
Nope. We'll see what I randomly decide to come up with for next week. But thank you guys for joining. This was nice. I liked it. I might like this a little more than I anticipated. But we'll see.
Cool.
We'll see how this goes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you guys.
See you guys.
Much love.
Night.
Happy Friday.
Happy Friday.
Get some sun.
Trying.